Hi everyone, the Season 9 PTR is over and I want to bring you my full feedback for Season 9 and what I just think about the game, my future wishlist, class balance suggestions, and so on. So I have compiled a pretty long document here about everything that I can think of. There might be more points out there that, I didn't really put in there, but I think there's going to be a lot already. I've already forwarded a lot of this in like individual bits and pieces to the devs anyway over the course of last week, and just in general in some of my videos lately. So I want to go through everything here, give my thoughts about the state of the game, and we'll see what happens with the final patch. And let's get started here. So first of all, let's jump into Nightmare Dungeons and the escalation sigils. So this is like a big new feature. They reworked Nightmare Dungeons, and I have to say I don't really like it all that much the way it is right now. So yeah, it is an upgrade to Nightmare Dungeons, which were kind of a thing that most people didn't care about, and they were just like sitting there and no one really played them, which is largely due to the fact that we just are busy farming other stuff like, pit for the glyphs and for our gear and for our XP. And then we have the boss farming and a little bit of crew outside the city maybe, and we don't really have a reason to do anything else. Well, Nightmare Dungeons are getting quite an upgrade here. So the new sigils are relatively good for example, farming materials, obols, gems, and these kind of things. So the rewards are kind of there, but the escalation is not there at all. So the way the system works is that you just have this escalation sigil, you start it, it starts a sequence of 3 dungeons that you just go from one to the next every time, and it gets like +1 positive, +1 negative affix every time. And at the end of the 3rd dungeon, there will be an extra like little boss room, the 4th one basically, where you have the Astaroth fight. I gotta say, this is just like not really escalating and we need a lot more. I think this could be made a bit similar to like the Diablo 3 Visions, for example, where it goes maybe like a random number of levels, something like maybe 5 to 15 deep, or maybe we can choose, I don't know, but there would be maybe some sort of, like longer progression through one of these sigils, and it gets harder and harder every time, because right now it does not get harder. Like these extra random Nightmare Dungeon affixes do literally nothing. Once you are in like T4 farming status, then, adding another plus 10% monster power or some random environmental affix or whatever, it just, you don't care, you don't feel it. And I think there needs to be something kind of like really scaling up, maybe +1 pit level per dungeon that you go, and you kind of like feel it becoming more and more intense. The runs get a bit slower, a bit more action packed basically, because the monsters live a little bit longer and they do their stuff, and then that could be a bit more interesting. So for now, I feel like the system needs a bit more work. And I also think that seeing Astaroth like every 10 minutes and fighting the same boss over and over is going to get pretty repetitive and boring really fast. So maybe this is fine for a season, but at the very least, after Season 9 is over, I think Astaroth needs to become like another boss, like a lair boss, similar to the other guys, and gets its own unique table and stuff like that. And then, why don't we bring back the Season 8 incursion bosses, for example? Where are those? They were just deleted, just like all the other season content we have ever seen in the game. And I think that's just kind of unnecessary. I think those incursion bosses were actually pretty good. And this would be a perfect place to put them. And then you have 10 different bosses that can pop up at the end of the escalation run. And there would be some variety, and I think it would feel a lot better. Yeah, then we have the strong rooms. So these are like little mini side dungeons that have spawns inside of Nightmare Dungeon. So there's a little portal you go through, and I think they are also kind of like not really exciting enough. There's a 2-minute timer to clear them, which is a very long timer because you have to wait even after finishing everything. So if you are fast, you have to just stand there and do nothing and twiddle your thumbs basically. That is a problem. And I also think that with the 2-minute timer, we just kind of like by default clear them, even on like kind of bad builds. So I think there should be like a 1-minute timer maybe, so that a good build is rewarded for going fast, and that you also get rewarded for making the right decisions, for example, and you don't have the situation where you just sit there and do nothing, because 2 minutes is a really long time. Generally, the strong rooms are pretty decent, but they're not like rewarding enough to the point where I want to just sit there for 2 minutes. I rather just, do 2 full dungeons in those 2 minutes, and, I cycle through the sigils faster and I get to the end and, kill Astaroth and so on. So right now, it's just not really great with this 2-minute timer, so I would like to see a shorter one. Then we have the XP dungeons. So Nightmare Dungeon leveling is actually going to be a really good strategy 1 to 60 next season. And this is largely due to the Forgotten Wisdom dungeons, which are pretty OP, especially early on. So this is nice to see a bit of like a change here, but on the other hand, there's a large swing in RNG with how good some of those dungeons are and you know how often you get those sigils. So you can do like a 1 to 60 run and see like one of those dungeons, and in that dungeon you get like, you know, 10 level ups in like 2 minutes, and then you just see no other dungeons with XP buff. So it's such a large jump that, you know, despite playing the same build, a leveling run from 1 to 60 can take twice as long because you just got unlucky with those XP sigils. So this is kind of like what it looks like. Like top runs with good RNG are something like 90 minutes, which is very fast. And, you know, kind of like bad to average RNG are like 2.5 hours. So maybe up to 3 even, depending on the class. So there is definitely a large gap here. I like that we have a different way to level now, which is competitive, but I think the RNG swings are a bit too much here. So this maybe could be adjusted a little bit with, for example, giving us more sigil powder so that we can craft more sigils or something like that, and kind of like even that out a little bit. But overall, I think 9-dimensional leveling is a good idea, at least for the early experience. Let's move on here to the season powers. So we have, well, basically the same stuff as before, just weaker. There's like this Horadic Spellcraft. Overall, it's like a relatively small impact compared to Season 8, which was already a relatively small impact compared to Season 7. So it seems like they are kind of reducing the impact of season themes in general, which is fine in my book. I actually am not a fan of these like borrowed power season themes very much. I think they're kind of like bland most of the time. And, you know, it's like very little creativity. And especially in Season 9, they literally brought back like half the powers from Season 7. So yeah, overall, I'm not really that much for or against this. Right now, it's kind of like, okay, they fix some small things in your build, you get a bit of barrier there, you remove the damage resistance aura here. Yeah, some stuff like that, basically, a bit of resources. So overall, yeah, it's a kind of okay theme, but it doesn't really strike me as anything like groundbreaking or so. So that's what I have to say here. Other than that, yeah, the damage resistance or removal is very inconsistent. So I'm usually running this in my like higher pit pushes, for example, and sometimes it just kind of takes too long to actually trigger. You lag out when you make a large pull on many builds. So there's something wrong with these damage resistance aura dudes in general. And especially when it comes to pit pushing, I think they are problematic. I would much rather see like a change to, you know, those guys just not existing anymore, at least in the pit, for example. And then instead, I would like to see like 10 other auras that can pop up, you know, that give the monsters something interesting, or like some debuffs to the player, and you kind of have to play around that. I think that would be a lot more interesting. Now let's talk about the barb a little bit. So for the barbs, I mostly tried the lunging strike build. I mean, it's like kind of the same for the other basic attack builds, because that's the only thing that's really new here and exciting. And it turns out that, for example, lunging strike is really good. So at least for like T4 farming, T4 content, speed running, this is like zipping around really fast. It feels good. So that was nice. Now these basic attack builds that will not like, you know, push pit 100 plus or something like that, like Earthquake does, for example. But I think this is solid at least. So that was nice. It felt good. It's just that the other basic skills are just a worse version of Lunging Strike in every way, basically. Lunging Strike has a built-in bleed, so you can proc stuff like Rage of Harrogate. It has a built-in mobility, so that's nice, and also can proc Moni rune, for example. And yeah, it just kind of like works the way you want it to work. And then there's like, you know, Bash, Frenzy, and Flay. Flay has a bit of potential as well, I guess, because you can scale it. But overall, the other basics are just inferior. And especially Frenzy is one that people really would love to see, and that has just never really been a thing. So it would be nice to see Frenzy as like a standalone build. In Diablo 3, for example, I think Frenzy was very fun. It had like a very unique mechanic. I'd like to see something like that coming back for Diablo 4 as well, with the barbs here. So this is like kind of like my feedback on the new stuff. I think Earthquakes, while they are kind of like by far the best on the class, they are in kind of like a good spot. So it makes the class strong. It, you know, you can push high. You have something to fall back to, and there's very many variations of Earthquake as well. So that's kind of nice. But it would be good to see more action here with basics and with core skills, which are even worse than the basics, basically. So core skills are really down bad, and there needs to be something done here. This has been the case ever since season 4, I think, when they introduced tempering and like all the crazy dust devil and earthquake stuff, and they have never recovered so far, and people have been asking every single season. So something needs to happen here. In general, I'd also like to see like a bit of more of the like actual like kind of barb, identity come back. Weapon swapping, for example, big cooldowns like Death Blow. Like I want to play something like Kratos Barb again from season 0, where I had like 4 different abilities or 5 different abilities on my bar that all did some damage. Like I want to see that stuff again. That would be cool. And also the class specialization with the weapon expertise and the technique slot is just extremely bland. Like we're 2 years in and I expected a big rework for this, for example, in the expansion or so, but that never happened. And it's still like every single build chooses the 200x technique, and half of the expertise slots are just kind of, useless, boring. They don't really do anything. So I would like to see a big change here. I want to see a much more impactful class specialization. I think we definitely need a rework here for the future. And then I would actually like to see all these like small little effects that we have right now be a baseline, like the implicit stats on the weapons for all the classes. I think that would be much more fun, so that you actually feel a bit of a difference between, choosing a pole arm and choosing a 2-handed sword or something like that. And right now it's like, okay, this thing has like 100 vuln damage and this one has 100 crit damage, which do exactly the same, and you barely notice them anyway. So I would like to see like little procs, little maybe multiplicative stats, something that makes a weapon choice a bit more of an impact, similar to, for example, rogues have the weapon mastery passive. That stuff needs to be like a baseline thing for all the weapons, for everyone. And that'll make it a lot more fun, I think. Let's talk about the Druid a little bit. So I tried Earthspike and Polarize, and other than that, I mean, Druid didn't really change. It just got like hefty nerfs because almost everything was overpower based. Cataclysm got target nerfed, and that's pretty much about it. But I mean, there is fun builds out there. I mostly want to talk about Polarize and Earthspike here, which are, kind of like an interesting new thing to try right now, because other than that, the class didn't change at all. I did talk about Polarize a lot in like a separate video already, so I'm just going to reiterate like a few points here. But the new weapon is pretty much dead on arrival right now. It's kind of too inconsistent. So there is a mechanic here that's kind of interesting, where it can snapshot the overpower that comes from the cast that procs the pool, and then every time you hit the pool, you get an overpower pulse, which is kind of nice. But it's like it's not really consistent, and sometimes it just doesn't get the overpower, and then it feels terrible. I think overall this thing could be redesigned a little bit to always have a guaranteed overpower, so that you have like a bit of like a consistent damage output, and maybe also make all other polarizers that go into the pool into guaranteed overpowers, because you still have this issue that despite the overpower nerfs, you have a lot of overpower synergy on Polarize itself. So like a Polarize overpower is like a times 20 of a non-overpower, for example. Like I cannot kill a small little skeleton, but then when I do overpower, the entire pack explodes, including the elites and stuff. So this just feels bad. Even if you get pretty consistent, frequent overpowers, I would like to see always overpower with something like that. This is a unique weapon that is supposed to like elevate the build, and Polarize is one of the worst builds out there for the Druid at least, and Druid is kind of the worst class right now. So we need something big here, and we can make it more fun while doing so. So there could be like a lot of cool stuff here with the new weapon, and I gave them some some suggestions on that and what to do. Let's see. For Earthspike, I gotta say, it was actually a pretty fun build. I don't really want to change that much here. I would like to see maybe a little bit better AoE coverage and maybe a little bit more damage output. But overall, this is like a fun new little thing you can do now with the basic buffs, and actually something that came out of the basic buffs where you can feel that. But a lot of people also want to see some stuff like the Crone build come back, like Stormclaw. Yeah, this was a kind of fun build for most people, and that is just like really dead right now, and would be nice to see maybe also like a big update to the unique stuff there, to bring back like another fan favorite Druid build. I think that would really hype up people, because right now I don't really expect much in terms of like Druids in season 9. And the last point is Rabid Bear is bugged, and Grizzly Rage is I tried that a little bit with some builds. It feels a little bit like I am pretty strong when I'm in Grizzly Rage, but then sometimes it falls off because, for example, when I go into a push scenario, I just kill stuff too slowly, and then you just instantly hit like a brick wall, because whenever you get out of Grizzly Rage and then you have to wait like 20 seconds to get back in, that's like too long of a gap. You don't really do any damage in between. It's also terrible for like boss farming, for example. Like the time it takes for Belial to die and then open a chest and spawn a new Belial is exactly the time for my Grizzly Rage to run out, for example. So that's just like terrible. And I would like to see Grizzly Rage become more of like a, kind of like a burst, like a maybe very short duration, very impactful kind of like DPS cooldown, without the like infinite extension, because that's just like so inconsistent. And like you cannot really slow down. And for example, you clear like a Heraldic strong room and then you pick up the loot and you go back to the rest of the dungeon, then your Grizzly Rage falls off, and these kind of things. It just kind of feels clunky the way it works right now, so I would like to see maybe some adjustments. Next, we have the Necros. Necros are overall in a really solid spot, I think. So they have multiple super strong builds, basically the same stuff that you've already seen: Bloodwave, Bone Spirit, Bone Spear, and so on. There's a bunch of bugs with all of them. I'm not going to go into those. But overall, Necros are looking strong. I also tried out the new like Skeletal Mage glove, which is also like a relatively fun way to play minions. Seems to be like some sort of pretty balanced alternative to like a regular minion build with like all the skellies, and here you have only the mages. So that works just fine. That will easily go to probably even pit 100 or so fully optimized. But it does really bother me that I really can't control these guys. So there needs to be some sort of like attack this target button or so, because they just kind of like shoot in random places, and those guys shoot like piercing bolts. So you kind of want to position them, in one way and then let them shoot through the pack in another, so that you actually hit most of the targets. And well, they don't really do what they're supposed to do basically half the time. So that is pretty annoying, and I think something like that needs to be fixed like ASAP. So I gotta say, like, I heard these kind of complaints from like minion players for the longest time. And for example, Companion Druid goes around that because you actually have an active ability that does a thing, but you don't have that at all on a Necro. You just kind of like sit there and you just hope for the best, which feels bad. Some general feedback on Necros I have is shields are completely unusable right now. So I would like to see them get offensive aspects and weapon tempers, so that they actually go back to the original intended balance of, being a little bit less damage, a little bit more defense, back to what it was in like, the early seasons basically. Because this is how they were originally balanced. It was roughly like a trade of, plus minus 10 to 20% damage versus defense, and that was it. But right now, they are completely unusable because they don't have the aspects and they don't have the tempers, but they are in a weapon slot, so you would never run them basically. I also think that the Necromancer Paragon boards are by far the worst designed in the entire game. Like every time I make a Necro, I have the same issue. Like I reach level 60, I open my Paragons, and I just want to vomit basically, because there's like, two decent options, like half another decent option, and then there's like just nothing that I want to put in my build. And this happens every single time I make a Necro. And not only that, but if you're Paragon 300, you actually just run out of good nodes to take, and you just pick up random int nodes. Like this is how bad it is basically. So Paragons need a bit of an overhaul here. There needs to be some more good generic stuff. We have like 2 minion boards, and then like, this blood board, and then the bone board and whatever, but they're all like way too specific. You can't really combine them. And like I always have to get in like, blood orbs somehow, which is mostly corpse tendrils, but then you don't have them on the boss. And then I have to somehow get in some corpse skill because of the flesh eater board, but I don't want to use corpses. I don't care. Like, it just kind of feels bad every single time. And I think that really holds back the class to feel, more fluid. Like if you want to make like a farming build that actually, just doesn't care about, these kind of slow and clunky mechanics, which are fine for like high-end content and bosses, but not really for like, just speed running, then I can't do that. Like there's no options. So I think something needs to be done here. Now let's talk about Rogue. Rogue's obviously something I have a lot of feedback on. First of all, some of the key passives. So precision is just like really terrible these days. There might be something like a Rain of Arrows or so that can run that, but that has the problem that, for example, you barely ever see your precision stacks. Like they're just a little buff on your buff bar that is like fully stacked with tons of other random stuff. So you can't even see the progression of your precision stacks sometimes, and it's kind of weak. Combo points in general are just dead basically. So a lot of stuff is really out of whack here, I think. Victimize just straight up does not exist, so that can be deleted at this point. Honestly, same with the alchemical admixture. While that can be played, I don't think it's a good design and probably should also be deleted because of that reason. So this has just the issue that you buff your imbuements, but then you don't buff your core skills, so you, for example, can't even trigger the imbuement, like a shadow imbuement, for example. And in the case of poison, you can just scale your core skill damage in other ways with one of the other key passives that also scales the poison imbuement. And for cold, alchemical admixture does nothing. So overall, there's a bit of a problem here with multiple key passes on the rogue that are just either not functional or just so bad that you would never even try, basically. And in other cases, just like bad design. So I think something should be done. Then we have the Shadow Clone as well. Shadow Clone is like a massive problem on the rogue. Basically, every build that is not a dedicated ultimate build, like Death Trap or Rain of Arrows, has to run Shadow Clone. And this just kind of like kills the entire fun of the class, I think. Like the Shadow Clone is just like bad AI, bad targeting. It does what it wants, and it completely outclasses the rogue, like the player damage itself. And that has been happening now last season, this season, like they've gone too far in fixing the clone. And not only that, but a lot of bugs remain as well. So half the mechanics don't actually work with the clone, but it's still so strong that you just like do all the damage with the clone. So it shoots past the boss and it just feels bad. You don't really have like this kind of like roguey feeling of being in control. You know, you press your buttons and you manipulate the battlefield. Like this is not happening because the Shadow Clone does everything. And it just feels terrible. Honestly, I'm just gonna keep repeating what I've been repeating for the last 1.5 years. Just delete Shadow Clone and everything would be better, I think. Like there's so much more stuff that needs to be fixed. I would rather just see a new skill, honestly. Like just delete that. But if we have to keep Shadow Clone, then at the very least, I think it needs a redesign. It needs to be something like similar to how Barrage functions as a base skill, where like, you know, the clones, like they spawn like right where you are and they shoot in the same direction where you are. So it's basically like a direct copy of the character. Like, you know, it does the same thing that the character does. And then I would say, okay, this would probably be okay because it's just kind of like a new flavor of, you know, have like these double shots or something that go in the same direction. That would be fun. That would be something pretty unique. But the way that the clone works right now, even if you try to improve the targeting and if you try to improve the balance so that, you know, the player damage matters more compared to the clone damage, for example, I don't really think we're going to get anywhere. So it's a struggle. Outside of that, I think the rogue build variety is relatively decent if you disregard the insane power of Death Trap. Death Trap is again the #1 build for like the 4th season in a row now, basically, on the rogue. So that is getting a little bit repetitive. People like Death Trap, it's really OP, I get that, but the build is too good, I think. It's just like doing everything, it pulls enemies, it makes you invincible, you have all the cooldowns every second. You know, it's easy to build, easy to play, like it kind of has a perfect storm of everything. It's not hard to set up, and it just destroys everything. So it completely outclasses the entire rest of the rogue kit, and there's not really any kind of buffing we can do to other skills that would compensate for that. Unless we want to give, you know, Twisting Blades, you know, like 3 separate spins around it in like, you know, various radiuses, and make pen shot shoot like 10 pen shots or 20 pen shots every attack, or make Heartseeker shoot 50 arrows on every click or something like that. So this is the amount of kind of like buffing we would have to do in order to be somewhat competitive with what Death Trap does. I think it's just not really healthy for the long-term perspective of the game. And I think something that for Death Trap that could be changed is just like the rank 5 pull is too much. Like it just like pulls in like the entire screen, but Death Trap already pulls in enemies by itself. That's already what the skill does and why we used it in the past. And then it just got like an even crazier pull on top of that. So I think that's like one big issue. And I mean, potentially it's also still just too strong in terms of damage output, but that's a separate thing. Like a rogue overall is not going to be the strongest class right now, so I don't really want to advocate for a nerf here. But at least the pulling stuff is going too far when it comes to Death Trap, I think. Other than that, I do have to say, I think it's going to be fun to play Rogue in Season 9. There's a ton of builds out there. So, for example, you also have a bit of a return of some of the core skills with at least Azure Wrath procs. You can make them somewhat viable. There's a few other builds out there that are not just Death Trap, that you can play into like the Pit 90 plus range and destroy everything in Torment 4. So overall, the Rogue is looking okay, but it does have some fundamental flaws right now with the Shadow Clones, with the Death Trap, and with some of the key passives, and that should be addressed in the future. Then we have the Sorc. So the new Hydra stuff is pretty strong and pretty fun, I think. So I think a lot of people are looking forward to that. But it's also a little bit boring when it comes to, for example, pushing. You kind of just like stand there like 5 seconds in a row, press one button, stand there again for 5 seconds in a row, press another button. So that felt a little bit boring. I would like to see maybe some kind of button I can press that, you know, slightly improves my damage. You know, something like a spammable fireball that just kind of like ramps up the damage of the Hydra or something like that. Just as an example. So I can, like, you know, not really feel forced to do this all the time, but where it's like, okay, at least I can do something, you know, this kind of deal here. But otherwise, I mean, the Hydras are cool. They have like a lot of flavor. They are strong. It's just that you have like so much power in like one single aspect, with a serpentine aspect, which is kind of wild. And that is like definitely somewhat unhealthy for the balance of the game. But at least Sorcs are having like a good time, I think, in Season 9 again. So even though, like, you know, the Enlightenment stuff has been fixed and the Lightning Spear is down bad now with the nerfs, that, yeah, they have other stuff. And besides Hydra, there's still other good builds out there. So there's like some Chain Lightning, Azure stuff. There is Meteor that's also like pushing into the 90s. So there's like a few builds on the Sorc. And overall, the class is looking pretty solid here. When it comes to the Lightning Spear nerf, I think it should maybe be changed a little bit. So Lightning Spear is not only really weak now, but they actually haven't fixed any of the fundamental problems of Lightning Spear, which was the negative single target damage. So I think that it should probably be unnerved a little bit, but it should be reduced in the amount of targets it can hit, which was, you know, basically the nerf that the build needed to get. So right now it still arcs to 5 targets, and then you just have no damage on the single target because it doesn't arc anywhere. So I think this arcing needs to happen also on the single target, or it needs to be just like fewer arcs, so maybe like 2 arcs instead of 5, for example, so that there's like a smaller gap between AoE clear and single target. Something like that needs to happen for Lightning Spear for it to be, you know, not a completely dead build at this point. Other than that, Enlightenment, while it's not really going to be the meta for all the builds anymore, it still feels terrible because they just, you know, kind of like nerfed it and fixed some stuff, but they didn't actually change how it works, and I think it just doesn't work in a good way. I would like to see some kind of like, you know, ramping, like up and down basically, and not this entire like, you know, feast on a famine, like you either have the buff or you don't, because it just always feels bad when like all the damage just falls off. And some builds just don't have an alternative to Enlightenment. So I like to see this like smoothed out a little bit, basically. Like maybe the Enlightenment stacks always decay at any point, but then you can, you know, ramp them up with, you know, cycling your different skills, and you try to keep them high. And like this, you just have like a bit more consistency, basically, in damage output. That would make it a lot more fun, I think. Another cool thing, I think, would be Incinerate while moving. So this works really well in PoE 2, for example. And I think even with like, you know, click to move users, if you make a large enough movement penalty without, you know, WSD or controller, you could still be able to like, you know, click somewhere and slowly walk there while incinerating stuff around you. That could be really fun and a nice little buff to the build and just make it more exciting, because right now Incinerate is like, it kind of feels nice to like beam stuff with this, but it's relatively weak, and it's also, you just stand still, so you're like a sitting duck. And a lot of people don't really like that, including myself. So it would be nice to see something here. Then we have like a pretty massive bug right now with Shatter, yet again. So Shatter and one of the season powers does some really funny calculations and just, you know, makes Sorcs go into like pit 120 plus or something because of some like double dipping or something is going on. So that needs to be addressed here. And well, one thing that I really like that I've also played a bit in Season 8 and on the PTR was Meteor. So I want to highlight that. I think Meteor build is really cool, but it just feels somewhat clunky. It doesn't feel like the Diablo 3 Tarasha Sorc. There's just something missing in terms of like the fluidity of the build. There's also too much visual clutter. You don't see anything. I would like to see some tweaks here maybe to make this feel better and be more playable without like crazy high-end cooldown gear. Now, for the Spiritborn, I also have a lot of feedback. I played this class the most since the expansion, and also on the Season 9 PTR, it's also looking like the strongest class by far going into Season 9 right now, disregarding the infinite damage stuff on the barb and the shatter stuff on the sword that is also likely to get fixed. And we have Spiritborn clearly ahead of the other classes, which is mostly based on a new Balazan pants. So this is a new unique that is actually pretty interesting and really strong, but it also really shows the difference in the build's powers between, like, for example, what we can do with this and what we have with, you know, for example, Capeleke builds and Sepazontic builds and all these other Spiritborn builds. In Season 8, a lot of people were complaining that Spiritborn felt pretty weak, which is partially true, let's say. So there were some builds definitely that are not really, you know, up to snuff when it comes to, like, you know, doing T4 bossing and all that kind of stuff. But overall, Spiritborn was in an okay spot. But now that we had the overpower nerfs and all of the Capeleke builds were using that, this is going way down. The basics builds, even with the buffs, are also just not really great. And well, we have like stuff like Evade, and then we have like Quill Volley, that's like the one build that really shines, and then the new Balazan stuff. Now, with that being said, I think the differences between the builds are too large. Balazan is too good, and the other builds are too weak. So I'd like to see some buffs maybe to Capeleke and Sepazontic, which mostly elevates almost all of the builds out there, at least. There are still other unique weapons that other builds use, for example, the Sunstained War Crozier for Touch of Death, which is also like a, you know, very much liked build, a very popular build, I would say. And that could maybe allow those builds to catch up to some other top builds out there a little bit, and also to the new like thorns, poison stuff that we have. And with that being said, there's also the Jaguar double dipping stuff still going on. So there are some unfixed bugs from Season 6 that I discovered again in Season 8 when I made the Vashan build. And now we actually just have every build using that, basically, when it comes to high tier pushing. So you have to play around those Mystic Circles, and they double dip into Jaguar Hall. So the Jaguar Hall does the damage of, you know, that you deal to the enemy, and then it multiplies again. And there's a few other effects that you can also use to double dip, but that's the biggest one. And it's just not really great gameplay for most people, I think. At least outside of a pushing scenario, these Mystic Circles are effectively unusable because they have a 10-second cooldown, and the only way to move them around is with another aspect that you just don't really fit into your build. You can't really fit in your build, and even if you do that, it's very clunky. So realistically, you have to play around this 10-second timer, which makes them impossible to use for T4 farming, for example. So there is like this weird gap between making a pushing build on the Spiritborn that is like many times more powerful than a farming build, and it just doesn't really feel great. Even when you go into T4, like bossing, for example, on many of those builds that will easily push 90 plus on a Spiritborn next season, they will not be able to kill Belial in a good time, for example, unless you go for the same push setup with the Mystic Circles, and then you have to stay in them, which you can't do on some boss fights, and so on. Realistically, all this double dipping needs to go entirely. In fact, I would actually hope for a redesign of the Jaguar main hall so that this problem just cannot come back, because I think even in the future, when they introduce new multipliers, there will always be some stuff breaking, and it's just also like the whole design of the Jaguar main hall is just so unintuitive. It's like so unequal between the builds. There's some builds that can really use it very well, and there's other builds that can kind of use it, but you know, you still have to because of the double dipping. So I would actually prefer if Jaguar Hall was just some more consistent and not a double dipping effect, basically. So that would be great. Now, that being said, it's kind of dangerous to do this right now without another PTR, because this would mean a pretty massive change in basically every single Spiritborn build out there, and mostly for the worse. So I expect if that was changed, a lot of builds would go down minimum 5 pit tiers, probably more like 10 pit tiers. So you're talking about a factor of times 10 or more of damage output. And this also means that a lot of builds that are kind of working right now would just fall into unplayable territory, even in Torment 4, for example. So that is a bit of a struggle here. So we need some real compensation, and then maybe this will work out. Overall, of course, this should be fixed long-term at the very minimum in Season 10. So yeah, let's hope for something here. Now, with all this being said, we have Noxious Resonance, which is nerfed key passive. This is the poison passive for the Spiritborn. And they have tried to make the single target a little better. It used to be 100% damage on single target and 20 on AoE. And now it's 180 and 20. but the gap between boss damage and AoE damage is still ridiculously large. Like all these, for example, Balazan builds that I just described with the new pants, they also run Noxious Resonance, and they have insane AoE damage. Like you blast through 110s, 115s, you can spawn the boss in 4 minutes or something like that, but you cannot kill the boss. Like single target bosses straight up just doesn't happen. And well, even the best boss in the game, like a Spirit Caller of Frost that constantly spawns ads, dies so slowly that even with 10 minutes on the clock, you will just fail sometimes. So this is how bad that is. So I would really like to see a much bigger shift towards single target damage for Noxious Resonance and less on the AoE side. So my suggestion would be something like 310, for example, because the gaps needs to be close. And then I would also like to see some other improvements for single target across the board. We have, for example, Potent passive, but the thing is that almost no one ever has a neck that has Potent on it. So this is like kind of like one way to solve single target damage compared to the AoE, which is a good thing, but you just don't get it. So you always have this AoE with a single target gap basically. And also other builds that rely on, for example, CCing enemies, like the Scourge multiplier, Revealing multiplier. There's a few things like that that I think should be maybe build a little bit more towards boss damage to make the entire class feel better. Then we have Razor Wings. That build exists and got a buff of some sort, but realistically, we're not even using the aspect that was just buffed. So Razor Wings is just not a build right now. I would also like to see maybe some cool new unique or something like that that makes this like a real ranged playstyle. Right now, everything is just kind of like face tank in melee range, vortex everything together, and that's it. And Razor Wings with like at least a spiraling playstyle that is like the best version of it currently is basically the same thing. It's just kind of like a scuffed version of a typical Kapeleke build. So I would like to see some real range build here, maybe combine it with the Seeker, so you throw down the ultimate and knock down enemies, and then you shoot at them from range or something like that. I think there is some really cool territory here that could be explored, but right now this ain't it. And lastly, we have the Hunter. The Hunter is a very fun ult. It's used in every single build basically, and it's just OP. And there's no way that any of the other ultimates can ever compete with that, no matter how much you buff them pretty much. They would have to get some ridiculous effects because Hunter is just that ridiculous right now. And the main reason for that is the +4 maximum ferocity, because you can get more ranks of the Furnace passive or like more benefit. And you also have the double damage against injured targets. So overall, the Hunter just gives you raw damage that no other ult does. So that needs to be addressed in some way. So realistically, I would like to see those two effects removed, and Hunter will still remain a very good ult, very useful for many purposes. But then we also have some room to actually buff up the other ultimates into usable territory. So realistically, I would like to see Hunter being like kind of like a speed farming thing mostly. And maybe if you have some real big synergies, then you also keep that in the push, for example. But other than that, we have the other ults that are more slow paced and maybe could do something of their own that is like special. And also, for example, the Devourer is something that a lot of people would really like to see, including myself. I would really like to see some kind of Devourer minion build, but like an active playstyle, not just, okay, summon it every 15 seconds and then AFK, but, something where, maybe we control it or we buff it and, the worm goes around and just like blasts everything with laser beams and stuff. That would be fun. Now, with all the class stuff out of the way, let's talk about some of the like overall like game systems and game balance. So first of all, experience. It's like the 5th season, 6th season now, where the pit is basically the only way to really farm experience. Everything else is useless, and I think that doesn't feel good. I think experience and like Paragon levels should be, some kind of formula that includes your efficiency overall and your game time. And that would make sense. But right now, it's basically just the number of pits you have run, somewhere in the range of like, 60 to 100 or something like that, because the XP barely goes up when you go higher tiers. But also, the only thing that matters is just like completing the pits really fast, and you get like this massive chunk of bonus XP. And in fact, that is not even buffed by, like the XP events that we got. We just recently got Mother's Blessing again with like a 35% experience buff. And you think, oh man, I'm gonna farm Paragons now. Well, it doesn't even buff the experience in the pit, or at least the biggest part of it is not actually affected, which is the completion reward. So I think that needs to change. I think the completion reward needs to be removed entirely. And then maybe, this needs to be tweaked a little bit between the different content types, like Infernal Hordes would be the next best thing. So that maybe could also be tweaked down slightly in terms of experience. And I would rather just see like, a better representation of all of the different content types here to gain experience, especially now in season 9 with like nightmare dungeons being like a large focus. Nightmare dungeons are abysmal for experience, and well, nothing is changing about that, which really surprised me. So something should be done here, and then maybe like an overall reduction in XP required, so that we keep like the time required the same. Let's say roughly 100 hours or so is a good time for reaching Paragon 300 when you play efficiently, and that should be spread out across all of the different content types, for example. Then we have boss farming. That remains a problem ever since season 2, and well, we continue to just farm way too many bosses. The intent was we do less bosses with the changes to the boss ladder in season 8, but that has not happened because they nerfed the loot, which means we have to do more bosses and not less bosses. And almost no one has the ability to farm Belial unless you trade a lot or you benefit from like the dupe economy on softcore. But for example, for me, I've played, I don't know, maybe 400 hours or so in season 8. I didn't buy any materials from anyone, and I've killed maybe 50 Belials. And all the other bosses I've killed were just the smaller bosses, or like, 200 Duriels and 200 Andariels. I have to suffer through those immunity phases like 200 times each and all that kind of stuff. And well, it just feels terrible to do that, to be honest. Belial is pretty OP, but realistically, without like, dupes, exploits, economy, and so on, we can't farm him enough, not anywhere near enough to actually get our stuff. So I think something really has to change here when it comes to boss farming. Like, we need way fewer mods. I want to see them less often, and I want to get way more rewards for each kill. And I don't really mind if the bosses are buffed. I think that would actually be preferable. It's fine that we can kind of one-shot them on like the super OP builds when we're like really decked out, but maybe a little buff to the boss HP wouldn't hurt, so that when we kill them much less often, let's say we only do 50 boss kills in a season, and that reliably gives us, all of the uniques we ever want, all of the mythics we ever want, and so on. And, I wouldn't mind killing 50 bosses in a season where I fight them each like 2-3 minutes or something like that. But I do mind if I have to kill them 1,000 times and one-shot them over and over. It's just boring. It's not good gameplay. And yeah, I just want to uninstall basically every single time. So hopefully we can get something like that. Another thing is also the Kura's tributes are just way too good at giving us the materials that we need, and you can like infinitely chain them right now. So you do bosses, you get the tributes, you do the tributes, you get the boss mats, and it gives you so much. Like, every single tribute is like 2 to 3 boss spawns on average for one Undercity run. Like, there's no way that farming Helltide for Living Steel or farming Whispers for the Vashan mats or so could ever compete with that. You just get way too much from the tributes. And I think we should go more towards the target farming that we had in the past, where, we farm Helltide to get our Living Steel, to go do Gikuar, to then go do Duriel. And, we farm the Whispers to get the Vashan mats, to then go do Duriel, and so on. So I think that was way better, because we can actually target the exact items that we care about, and it all just made more sense. And there was more variety in the play styles, and there was more variety in the different content that you do, and it just felt a lot better to me. Another thing about bosses is also that they are way too good at giving you everything in the game. You get the most amount of gold, you get the most amount of crystals, salvage mats, normal materials, forgotten souls. Like, they literally give you everything but legendaries. And legendaries are not really that hard, just, when you're found in the pit and so on, you can get over obols, you get the stuff that you need anyway. So basically, the bosses give you everything that is not legendary items. And they're just by far the best for that. I think all of the material drops should be straight up removed from the bosses, and they should be redistributed into other content types, because again, we do way too many bosses, we do way too many pits, and we do way too little of everything else. And there is so much content in the game that we could, you could take legions and you put the common materials there, and we take the hell tides and we put the souls there. And right now we don't have any form of target farming for most of these materials. We can't really, fix any, bottleneck that we have, for example, besides Autosite. Basically, you can go and farm Autosite, and some hours you can get thousands of thousands or hundreds of thousands of Autosite if you want. But all the other stuff, you just like very slowly accumulate. If we ever run out of that, it's just like a logout angle basically for the rest of the season, because you can't really get it besides farming more of those bosses. But if you already have all the items, that just feels like a terrible thing to do for that purpose. In general, I also think that we still get, flooded with way too much loot and way too low quality loot. Now, there was a buff to the ancestral drop rates and the multi-GA drop rates on the PTR, but I can't really say that I've noticed it very much. So if you look at the data from before and after, maybe we'll know, but Blizzard hasn't really told us how much they buffed it, and I also can't really say that I noticed all that much. So realistically, I am kind of hesitant to call this like a big improvement. And we still need to go way further in the direction of less loot and better loot. Like when I'm farming Torment 4, I don't want to see a single 750 item. I would just prefer those items to just not exist. Just don't drop them. And I would be happier, basically. And the same goes for the loot caches. We get like tons of loot caches on the season wrap and from the season journey. And, everywhere we get these boxes and you just open them and there's like 200 items piling out. I don't really see what's the purpose of that. I don't really get, like enjoyment from this. So yeah, that could maybe also be changed. Then we have Enchanting. That remains a problem, especially when it comes to like some of the like harder to get pieces. Now, I do like that there are items that are really hard to get and they're kind of a chase, but in some cases they're also, so impactful that, it feels really bad when you don't get them. Like if you're talking about certain things like envenom ranks for druids or neck, like every build on druid wants that, and it's like by far the biggest multiplier you can get, on any piece. It's like 10% per point, so you really want to get that envenom 2 ranks, and then you want to master it up and so on. And similar with like potent ranks on the Spiritborn or with primordial bindings on the Sorcerer and so on. Every class has like this 1 or 2 shining, incredible passes, and if you don't get them, your character is suddenly so much weaker, which is part of the problem of those passes being too good, and the other part of, we just can't get those items. Like even if you try to enchant for it and you have like 2 billion gold, there's a really good chance that you will not have the outcome that you're looking for at the end. So that is crazy to me. And not only does it cost a lot, and you also need the materials, but you also need a lot of time. You literally have to stand in town half an hour just rolling, and you better hope you don't accidentally misclick at the end, and then you might see it once. So this is just way too crazy. I think in general, enchanting weights, it seems like they are using the weights that the drops use. So when an item drops on the ground, it has like this chance to drop with life, and this chance to drop with main stat, and this chance to drop with passive, and so on. And it seems like exactly the same chances are applied to enchanting, and that is just like illogical. So on the items on the ground, it makes sense that there is like a certain pool of stats that show up that are generically useful all the time, like life, main stat, movement speed, whatever. And all the rarer stuff that is like more build specific, like the passes, like the skill ranks and so on, this is the stuff that should be higher weighted when we go to the enchanter in the end, so that we actually have a chance to make the item what we need it to be. And lastly, we also have like a massive gold problem. In softcore, there is way too much gold because of duping and the RNT economy. And then, for example, in hardcore, or if you're just like playing SSF and you don't trade, you just don't have any gold at all. And again, we go back to boss farming, and then the best way to get gold is you vendor the uniques that you get from the bosses, and there's not even a sell all button in the game right now. So it's kind of a joke, I gotta say. And the like target farming of gold that we have with like, Infernal Hordes, gold chests, and the whispers, they are completely laughable, even in comparison to like the boss farming and the vendoring of items there, for example. But also in general, like you open a whisper chest, you get like 5 million gold if you're lucky. Which, you can roll your weapon like once at the enchanter, or 1.5 times maybe, and your amulet maybe 2 times. It's really a joke. So I think that this needs to be addressed as well, together with this. And well, in general, like, we need some improvements for loot to just feel better across the board. Now, something that was not changed, but that I really want to see some improvements for is also the pit. So I have some points for that. First of all, I think a 15-minute timer for the pit is a massive mistake when it comes to Diablo 4. Diablo 4 is a game that's just like not very well designed for long combat. We have these scenarios where if you push, you have like 10-minute boss fights, 8-minute boss fights. A 5-minute boss kill is extremely fast when it comes to like a push. So they're just like too boring, too slow, too undynamic. A lot of stuff needs to be done here. I think a pretty easy win could be to just reduce the pit timer to force us into lower tiers, so that we have, kind of like reasonable gameplay basically. So like a 4 or 5 minute run with like a 2-3 minute boss or something like that would sound a lot more reasonable, a lot more fun than what we currently have. If you try to go for high tiers, which okay, I agree is optional, but also you want to push your glyphs and you want to see how strong is your build and you want to see how far you can go maybe or something like that, it just doesn't feel great because it's all is like face tank everything, nothing is threatening to you, and it's just boring. So that would be a very easy win, but there's a lot more stuff that would have to be done to make the pit really interesting, especially if you're looking towards the future. Expansion 2 is coming, leaderboards are coming, and almost guaranteed we're going to have pit leaderboards, and a lot of people are asking for that. But in the current version of the game, if we had leaderboards, like real leaderboards for the pit, that would be a disaster, I think, because it's just not fun. Compared to Diablo 3, where, solo pushing, for example, or even group pushing is, that is like amazing. There's so much strategy, tactical gameplay, there's, there are threatening elites, there's a dynamic combat, we have stuff like Oculus rings, and we have stuff like Zay's Stone of Vengeance, so that a ranged build can actually play at range and is incentivized to do so. And all these kind of little things that just make Diablo 3 pushing what it is do not exist in Diablo 4 right now. So there's so little skill impression, so little kind of like fun basically when it comes to the pit, and something like this would already help a great deal. In general, I think also everything just needs to become more threatening. Like elites in Diablo 3, you have to respect them, you have to, you have to dodge affixes like Arcane Enchanted and Mortars, or you will just die really fast. And in Diablo 4, we don't care about anything at all. Like even on the bosses, for example, people just make characters that are so tanky that you just face tank even the shadows and the Lilith waves and everything. And, let alone the elites that literally do nothing to you. So this entire gameplay loop of, you make a pull and then just face tank everything until it's dead and everything feels so spongy needs to be broken up in some ways. That we need something where, we need positioning requirements, we need to dodge stuff, we need faster combat as well, we need to be able to make more pulls, and then the pit could actually be interesting as like a competitive feature. But as it is right now, if you got leaderboards today for the current pit, yeah, that'll be hilariously bad. So something needs to change, and I think we should get started now so that we can tweak more stuff later when it's actually time to introduce the leaderboards. We also have to damage resistance auras. We do get a seasonal buff for that to remove the aura, but that's kind of like slow and clunky and inconsistent, and half the time just doesn't really activate, even if you try to clump the entire pack into 1 pixel. So yeah, that's kind of a problem. And I agree, in the pit, maybe those guys shouldn't exist. Instead, I would actually just like to see like 10 new auras. These champion monsters, they are kind of an interesting concept. But we only have this one type of champion, and why is there not like another dozen types of champions that has different auras, that gives monsters like a haste aura, or gives you a debuff to the player, or slows you down and freezes you, or maybe like every other monster about it is empowered with some other thing. Like there could be so many possibilities to make this more interesting and also dynamic, and gives you something to think about in the heat of combat basically, that would make this more exciting. And lastly, it's been 5 seasons of backtracking in the pit. I think that really needs to go. At the very least, just give us a 3rd floor. I'm not sure why that has not been implemented like 1 year ago, for example. But I think that would be an easy win, because even while farming, the pit sometimes just doesn't feel great, because you just run out of monsters, you forgot this one monster in the corner and this one pack there, and then you have to walk back 30 seconds into nothing. That is terrible, so that needs to change as well. Alright, now with all that being said, for Season 9 feedback, I also want to go through my future wish list, so like more long-term, let's say. So, all the stuff I discussed was mostly for the PTR and so on, and what we got right now. But yeah, maybe more stuff that they could add in the future. So first of all, I think Malphas is like a very much liked boss, and I don't see why we don't have him in the game. Like an Echo of Malphas lair boss fight would be very fun. I think this is actually one of the better designed bosses out there. And we also have the problem, for example, that bosses have like overlapping loot tables. You could actually spread out all of the uniques a lot more between every single boss. I would prefer every single boss to have its own loot table, and then whenever new uniques are introduced, they get like maybe 1 extra unique or something. Just kind of spread them out more. Because right now, I talked about this earlier with like farm too many bosses, it's also partially the problem that there is all this like dilution of the loot table now with like the random drops, and just bosses have way too many items in their loot table. So that could also be helpful here. Also, in general, I just dislike that we constantly make new season content and then just delete it from the game. I would like to see some stuff come back. So, for example, the Witch Tide in Season 8, I think was a pretty massive success. People liked it. And it was, rewarding, a nice way to farm whispers and so on. And, just thematically, why not just bring this back for 1 month every year? It doesn't have to be like a permanent thing, but it would be something to look forward to in like the Halloween season. You have the Witch Tide as well, and it just disappears in November again or something like that. So that could be cool. Bloodseekers were always fun, I think, so they should maybe come back as like a butcher type event, for example. Malignant Tunnels, from Season 1, maybe that could be a way to bring back something like, legendary jewels or something like that, like sockables, similar to the season stuff we have now. That could actually be like a permanent feature for something to work on. Maybe this is like a Torment 4 only feature, for example, so that you actually have a bit of an incentive to go there and make a character strong enough and farm this. And then you have like some kind of like late game progression that you can work on. So there's so many things that I think have been introduced in the game at some point that the devs could draw from to very easily make the game more than it is right now. Another thing would also be targeted rune farming and crafting. So for example, why don't we just have like, every lair boss has a certain, affinity towards certain rune drops, maybe similar to like mythic items as well. So maybe you can farm certain mythics better from certain lair bosses, like Andariel's Visage drops from Andariel and stuff like that, right? I think that would make a lot of sense. And again, together with like more target farming in the game, everything would just feel a lot better. We would have a lot more player agency, and it's not just this like, okay, lottery and hope for the best. Then you have tempering and masterworking. This is also like a pretty big topic of discussion. Now it seems like Blizzard is open to at least changing masterworking a little bit, which is long overdue. So realistically, we need a way to not fully reset the item every time you masterwork and reset, because it also just doesn't make any logical sense. Like you have to, farm up a bunch of materials, and then you take your item that is already 12 out of 12, where you think, oh, this is fully upgraded, and then you reset it to 0. And if you don't hit at least the same combo of, the right stats again that you already had, trying to improve it, well, you're gonna end up worse than before, which is just terrible. So I think that should not be the case. We need like a way to not fully reset everything, but maybe 4x4. We also need UI improvements, because even when you have infinite amount of materials on the PTR, for example, like you stand there for hours masterworking your stuff back and forth, like it's just clunky, slow, like way too many clicks. So something needs to happen there as well to make this more comfortable. But yeah, this is definitely what we need for masterworking. And then for tempering, well, a lot of people are unhappy with like breaking their loot when it drops, and you can't ever really feel excited about finding a big item, because you still have this moment of, oh man, I have to survive the tempers. So that is kind of bad. And even if you do that, then comes the masterworking, and if you have already invested, dozens of hours or something of farming for that one item to masterwork it to perfection, well, even if you find a better version of that item, you're not gonna do that. So maybe there would also be some form of like, recouping the investment into your masterworking that you have, but also the tempering needs to change. Like we need to have some kind of reliable way of getting the tempers that we want. Maybe you could choose the temper outcome and then it just rolls the range, or maybe you could at least reuse scrolls more often so that we have a way to unbrick an item and just farm it to perfection, for example. That also wouldn't hurt really. There's definitely other options to explore here, and I would actually like to see something that is like tempering or some form of breaking the item that comes at the end of the journey and not at the start of the journey. Like when I have my perfect item and it's already done, and then I can YOLO, something like the Val Orbs from PoE, for example. I think they are amazing, and we need something like that. We don't need to break our items as a first step, but rather as the last step, because at some point you do get those copies, you find, the same glove again, you find the same pants again, and so on. And what do you do with them? Well, you just vendor them. So realistically, it'll be fun to, try to gamble with our items a little bit, but not at the start of the journey. And while we're at it, I think tempering is also just too bloated of a system. I think we can easily cut something like 80% or so of the stats and the temper recipes that exist right now, and no one would even notice really. There's like so much like random, you know, just interchangeable stuff, especially on the offensive tempers. You know, there's crit damage, there's wound damage, there's fire damage, there's you know, damage while fortified, and realistically, you know, right now they're all the same values even. So most of these conditions are always met anyway for many builds. So I think we can just really trim that out. You know, it has kind of shown itself with time that we don't need that many recipes. So that could be reduced. Recipes could become smaller. And in general, I think long-term at least, we also have the problem that, for example, we have the double damage tempers, we have the double hit tempers, and double projectile stuff, for example, on the weapons. And they also kind of like hinder game design a lot, and also just make everything kind of like, you know, too out of control and too imbalanced. So what I mean is, especially like if you have so much specialization into a single skill, you never get back to a point where you can use multiple skills in your build to deal damage with, because, well, you have to put everything you can into that one skill. And that's not really a problem by itself, but the big problem is that we don't have the option to make a build that deals damage with multiple skills at all. Like old Kratos Barb, old Flurry RF Rogue, Pen RF Rogue, all these things were just instantly killed back in Season 4 with Loot Reborn. And I don't think that this is really the right way forward, especially if we're looking towards the, you know, expansion to skill tree rework and aspect rework. I think tempering also needs to be part of that equation. And in general, I just think that the game has kind of evolved a little bit too much into like a, you know, face roll spam fiesta. I talked about like the face tanking in the pits, for example. Every build just revolves around making a pull, pulling it together somehow with like ward hacks or something like that. And then just face tank until everything is dead. And even if you make enemies a lot more dangerous with like elite affixes being scaled up or something like that, everything just still feels like too much. Like, you know, you just spam everything you can, you face roll all of your cooldowns, and that's about it. So I think realistically, long term, let's say expansion 2 rebalancing, we will need, you know, less attack speed and less cooldown values across the board. I think also like this current attack speed system right now is just way too confusing for people with like cap 1, cap 2, what goes where. You always have to look that up. Even me, that, you know, theory crafts like dozens of builds every single patch. You know, I always have to have our Maxwell page open to look at the caps and see, okay, what is cap 1, what is cap 2? Like, there's no way that anyone really enjoys that. And I think also just stuff has become a little bit too silly, too out of control. So I would like to see a rebalance here that brings stuff down to earth a little bit more than it is currently. So maybe one unified attack speed cap and, you know, generally less cooldown values. Maybe also something like a maximum 1 mythic equipped limit would make a lot of sense, because we have a lot of cool, unique items and aspects in the game that just never have a time to shine because we have mythics in the game, and, you know, many builds run like 3, 4 mythics, and it's always the same stuff. It's always a Shroud, it's always a Starless, it's a Perdition or a Shaco, and, you know, if they ever introduce more mythics, well, we're also gonna have that in our build. So yeah, if they ever buff, you know, a Havarion and the Shattered Vow that people request to get buffed because they suck, well, we're gonna have those in our build as well, right? So it's just gonna get worse and worse and worse, and more and more and more cookie cutter, and I think that's exactly the wrong way to go. So I would also like to see maybe something like that. And with that, I conclude my video here. So this was a very long video now, but yeah, this is what I got, at least for my Season 9 feedback. Obviously, there's more stuff I could talk about for hours about everything in the game, but I didn't want to bloat up this video too much here. So hope you enjoyed this video here. Let me know what your thoughts are. What is the stuff I forgot? What do you really agree or disagree with? I'll be checking that out, and then I'll also send all of this to the devs and hope for the best, I guess. So usually we have pretty bad PTRs. This is something to keep in mind. The PTRs are always scuffed and terrible, and then the live server patch comes like a month later, and they do tend to make pretty good updates from PTR to live. So I am cautiously optimistic right now that Season 9 is going to be pretty fun. I had a lot of good time in Season 8 actually, and Season 9 seems to be a bit of a continuation of that. So I'm looking forward to it personally. But of course, Diablo 4 could always be better than it currently is, and there is still a lot of low-hanging fruit, a lot of like bigger, you know, overarching changes that need to happen to the game to make it more fun. And this is just like my opinions on that. So for now, this is just what I got here. I hope you liked this video. Subscribe if you enjoy my content, and see you guys next time.